Hello, everybody. Today we're going to look at liberalism. We're starting the liberalism module, and so we're going to start that with a bit of an introduction to liberalism. You'll see that this actually comes from the Doyle reading that you should find up there on Canvas and be able to read for yourself if you want. It really is just, I think, this lecture that comes from the Doyle reading, but yeah, you can almost skip the lecture if you do the reading, but certainly in this lecture I will try to outline some of the main points from the reading. So again, the reading is optional. All right, let me share my screen. So as I said, this is mostly taken from the Doyle reading. It's an introduction to liberalism. And it sort of starts with this premise, this idea that the liberal states are fundamentally against war. Just something quick to sort of mention about liberalism, perhaps even before we really get started with the slides, is that liberalism comes along really into international relations scholarship around the 1970s. So you see this Doyle piece is from '86, but some of the other lectures will be taken from an earlier work by Kohei and Nye, which I think is 77 maybe. Towards the end of the 70s, anyway, one of the things that's going on at that time in terms of world history and events in world politics is that there's a bit of a thaw in relations between the United States and the Soviet Union. A cataclysmic war, a nuclear war between the two superpowers is looking less and less likely. They're starting to sort of incorporate one another into their view. They're starting to sort of live with one another, really, start to hold summits and be able to deal with one another. The other thing now is that it's been, since the end of the Second World War now, at this point it's been 30 years, almost a whole generation. And people are starting to ask the question, like, well, why, if the realists are right, liberalism is a reaction against realism, really, or it's a sort of an attempt to correct realism in some ways. But the question is, like, if realism's right, if we're living in a world where it's a war of all against all, and if it's really just a balance of material capabilities that's really keeping the peace, then, why aren't there more wars? What's happened? We don't seem to be living in a world where everyone's constantly at war with everybody else. It doesn't seem to be the case. Maybe it seemed to be the case in the first half of the 20th century, but perhaps not halfway through the second half of the 20th century. It starts to look not like that. And even, like I said at the beginning, even the two superpowers seem to be, if not exactly getting along, might be too much to say, but they're figuring things out together. They're living with the presence of one another. And so, perhaps realism doesn't have all the answers, and perhaps we should try to explore what some of the answers are. And so, this is one of the sort of premises, one of the basic answers that people come up with, and it's that liberal states are fundamentally against war. There's something that prevents, something fundamental, something basic that prevents liberal states going to war. Now, I should mention, perhaps, we're talking about liberalism. The word liberalism, we use it in terms of American politics, in terms of sort of things that you might read in the newspaper or see on Facebook or whatever social media you use, in articles that you might read, in conversations with your friend, right? You might talk about liberalism in a particular way, right? And you might associate it with perhaps the Democratic Party, right? You might associate it with things like, sort of protection of rights, and perhaps even probably like a modern liberal, like a T.H. Green, 1850s sort of an idea of, let's make people free by removing obstacles from their life, like poverty and lack of education or lack of good health care, right? You might think of liberalism in that. You should probably put that to one side for now, and really liberalism in terms of international relations means something a little bit different from that. I mean, perhaps it all goes back to the same place, but its common ancestors quite a few generations back now. So we should put that aside for now, and we should look at this. So when I say liberal states, what I mean mostly, right, is sort of democratic states, right? States that you and I might look at as liberal democratic states. Probably the United States itself, Canada, certainly Western Europe, like Britain, France, especially, these days, certainly Germany and Italy as well. You know, and probably other places around the world, like Japan, likely, Australia as well. Anyway, India. These are the states that we might call liberal states. And really, in international relations, we're using the term liberal states oftentimes to distinguish between sort of maybe free countries, democratic countries, and authoritarian countries, right? And so that's something that we should keep in mind for now. And we'll see, of course, as we go over the next 4 or 5 lectures, you know, your sort of understanding of liberalism in terms of what it means in international relations should grow, should develop, should become more sophisticated. But let's start at this point where let's forget everything that we know about anything called liberalism and just for now think of liberal states as those states that are not autocracies, that are not led by authoritarian leaders. All right. One of the things about liberal states is that they have citizens, right? And these citizens have some sort of say in the government, right? They choose the government in some way. You know, they have some sort of an election, you know, and there's different versions of how it works, right? Some have presidents and some have, some are parliamentary democracies, right? Some are constitutional monarchies. You know, there's different kinds of constitutional setup, but ultimately there's some way where the citizens can have major input into policy, into governmental policy through elections, through changing the government and through selecting governments that they want to represent them. So that's what we mean by liberal states. So again, the thing with the liberal states is that it's citizens who elect governments. And the thing is with war as well is that generally speaking, you know, it's not the rulers who are bearing the burdens of war oftentimes. I mean, they have, of course, some burdens, some responsibility for making big decisions, right, and for putting people in harm's way. And, you know, that's not nothing. I don't mean to, but in terms of, you know, going to the front line, fighting, dying, in terms of having, you know, major disruption to your life, you know, having to change jobs. Now you used to do this job, now you work in a munitions factory, right? You know, rationing, you know, these things fall quite heavily on the sort of ordinary citizens of the country, and oftentimes, you know, the leaders, those in positions of power and those with elite status might have, you know, several levels of protection, right, and sort of insulation between them and the conflict, right? So that's something, right? And so if you've got the same people who are bearing the burdens of war, who are also choosing the government, then the thought might be that in liberal states, because you have these citizens choosing the governments, they might choose governments that fight wars much less frequently. If, you know, because the assumption is that the reverse is true, right? That if the citizens have no say in the government, if they're not choosing them at all, if you have an autocracy, a dictatorship, something like that, a monarchy perhaps, like an absolute monarchy, well, now what have you got? Now you've got a situation where those who are making the decisions about whether to go to war or not are the ones who are probably most insulated from the immediate effects of the war, and so they might be willing to risk the lives of other people's sons and daughters, and, you know, destroy other people's businesses and livelihoods. That might not be, you know, because they might be insulated from that. Right? That's the thinking in liberal theory of international politics. So, okay, so in liberal states, they might be fundamentally against war because the citizens who bear the burdens of war elect the governments, and they appreciate, in particular, the benefits of trade, which can really only be enjoyed during peace. You know, to think of some sort of minor benefits, of course, not to trivialize it, but just to sort of give an everyday examples, things like having, you know, if you live in Britain or the United States, for example, tropical fruits. I don't know if there's parts of Florida where you can grow tropical fruits, but generally speaking, right, you can't grow tropical fruits here, at least not in big numbers, and so you've got to import those. And certainly if you live in Britain, you can't grow anything, you know, unless you like apples, you're out of luck. You know, apples and turnips, basically, right? So, you know, unless you're really fond of those things, if you want sort of a variety of fruits and vegetables, well, war is going to seriously disrupt your supply of those things, you know, and it might make you upset. So, you know, trade happens during peacetime, it gets disrupted usually during war, and so you want to, you know, you want to keep the peace as much as possible. You know, it's not to say that you're never going to vote for war, but you're going to be a bit more pacifistic, a little bit more peaceful, only fight wars when it's absolutely necessary. And so the argument then is, right, the answer to this big question about, well, why isn't there more war? If the realists are right, there should be more war. Well, the answer to that is that, well, look, there's all these liberal states like the US, Japan, and countries in Western Europe, and the fact that they all exist, that leads to peace. Because we've got all these countries now where the citizens have some say. Since the Second World War, right, citizens have some say in these countries now, and they don't want war, so governments don't make war, unless again it's absolutely necessary, and it generally isn't absolutely necessary. So it turns out, at least by the 1970s and 80s, and still even today, war is a fairly rare occurrence, at least for these big democracies. Well, at least not the sort of all-out major war that the Second World War was. We haven't really had another one of those. Okay, and so now we're going to sort of broaden this out. We've got this sort of very basic theory of liberal thought here, there's very beginnings of it, and we're going to spread it out a little bit. And you should see these themes that we've talked about will come back and back and back here throughout this lecture. You'll also, as we read Schumpeter, we'll go into sort of liberal pacifism. We'll talk more about the sort of economics and the benefits of having peace and the disruption, and what capitalism does, I guess, to people to make them less warlike. Then we'll have a bit of an interlude. We'll have Machiavelli here, who's actually makes an argument. It's in some ways a liberal argument, but it's against some of the things that we've been saying, right? That liberal states actually lead to more war, more conflict, and we'll talk about how that might be the case. And then we'll talk about Kant, where he is his liberal republicanism. And so we'll discuss these things. You should think of these three, they're sort of old thinkers, as you can see, right? They're all certainly long before, some of them longer than others, but certainly long before the 1970s. Kant's writing in the 1770s, for example. So, but they're sort of the very basic building blocks that later modern liberal thinkers have drawn from. So this is sort of the classical source of liberal theory in international politics. And the first one we'll look at is Schumpeter, liberal pacifism. So he says, look, there's this thing, it's called objectless imperialism. He says, back in the day, maybe imperialism had some sort of a purpose, but it doesn't have any sort of a purpose now. And so it's objectless, but it's basically what's happened is that imperialism in the 19th century, right, was important, it was necessary, it brought with it lots of benefits, right, in terms of much bigger markets for your country's products. That's the main one. Perhaps some tax revenue and that sort of thing as well in some cases, but maybe that's not as major a benefit. So imperialism had some benefit before, but now actually, at least we thought it had some benefit. Now that when we're looking at it, we're thinking, it was actually quite hard to police these sort of spheres of influence, or these sort of all these parts of the world where we were trying to exclude traders from other countries. And we figured out actually by the end of imperialism for Schumpeter, we figured out that actually let's just send our merchants out, let them compete with one another, and and then we don't have to pay the inordinate costs of sending a bureaucracy, of maintaining bureaucracy in a far off land, a bureaucracy and a military presence all the way over there to try and enforce it. It's inefficient, right? And it ends up costing us more than it's worth. And so we've moved past that period now. So now though we still have the vestiges of that left. We still have the sort of the remains of it, and that they're without a point now. There's no point to them, but they still exist. And so we have this thing. One of the things that we have is this thing called the war machine, right? And so armies, they used to be necessary to take over countries, but after we figured out that it wasn't worth it for Schumpeter, after we figured out it wasn't worth it to maintain these armies in foreign countries, well, they still exist, and these armies, they don't want to die, right? If you think of, for example, as I am, I suppose, as I'm saying these things, think of the British Army during the 19th century. Almost a third of the population of the world, right, it has to be controlled, right? So you have this big institution now that's built up around the British Empire. All these careers, right, all these the fortunes really that have been built up, and the status and the prestige are all based on the prestige and status of individuals and families. So based on this structure of the army and the navy, of course, as well. And now all of a sudden, after and this is later on, but now all of a sudden, we don't need so big an army, right? We're not going to maintain large armies in India, for example. And so now we're cutting back, but that war machine, both the army and the sort of the industry that supplies that army, it doesn't want to be cut down, and so it tries to pursue war. It tries to encourage warlike policies in order for it to still exist, right? In order for them to sort of maintain themselves, to justify their existence. So that's one of Schumpeter's arguments. He also says, like we have, from that time, we still have these warlike instincts, within us. And then, finally, the export monopolism, right? There are still some markets that are closed off to us that we might want to open through military intervention, right? Through war, and that. But again, I think I did this part at the beginning of this slide, right, where I said, Schumpeter's argument is that, like, look, that's an inefficient way to do things. Just send your merchants instead. Free trade is a better policy than trying to carve out specific markets for specific countries' goods. Your merchants can do just as well out there in Kenya. They can do just as well selling your goods and buying their goods, trading between Britain and Kenya. You can do that just as well without a huge army and a bureaucracy sort of trying to govern the country. It's not necessary. So he says, and this is, and so you can see with free trade, so if you expand that out sort of more broadly into the idea of capitalism, right? Capitalism is actually itself a force that changes the way people think about their relations with foreign countries, right? And about their relations with each other as individuals. Capitalism affects that. And so it removes them from this. One of the things it does is it individualizes us, right? If you're an economist, right, or you're interested in economics, one of the things that you might think about a sort of rational choice theory, right? And you might think, well, economics, I think, generally speaking, traditionally at least, tends to think of people as sort of self-interest maximizing units, right? Where here I am, Dr. Pout, and I have these interests, right? And I want to make sure these interests are met, right? So how can I meet these interests in the most efficient way? How can my interests be met, right? And capitalism, says Schumpeter, it makes people think of themselves as individuals, right? So now I don't think of myself, perhaps, according to Schumpeter, I don't think of myself as sort of part of a broader community, right? A country, part of a hierarchical society. No, I think of myself as an individual that can sort of negotiate all those external structures and beat them in some way, right? I can rise above my station, or I can, I'm not just a particular, right? Because perhaps before the Industrial Revolution, there was probably more of a thinking amongst people generally of being perhaps like a cog in a machine, right? Although that's a very industrial, cog in a machine is a very industrial metaphor, and so perhaps that's not quite the right way to go. But they think of themselves as they have a particular role in society, and they understand their relationship to other people around them, and those relationships are sort of fixed in some way, and so that you have this hierarchical society that you're sort of a part of, and you perform this particular function in it, and you have to sort of think of the good of everybody else, right? I perform this task for the good of the community, right? And really, community prospects perhaps even interests maybe come before yours, right? And it's all about the smooth running of society, and you better play your role. And capitalism really takes us out of that, it removes us from that, from the Industrial Revolution. Probably it removes us from that, and it makes us think about what's in my interest, what's my own individual interest, and how do I go about getting it. And you have the whole, and this is maybe where liberalism starts to sort of connect to some of the political theory of political ideology of liberalism, right? Where you say, I'm an individual, like how do I flourish? Like we're all different, and like the government and society should get out of your way. It should even perhaps remove obstacles from you so that you can reach your own potential, which is different from somebody else's, and your own ends, right, which is different from the people around you. So that's what I mean by and Schumpeter thinks it's capitalism that does that. The system of capitalism individualizes us. Right? We have our own labor to trade, and we trade our labor for the other things that we need. Or, if we're fortunate enough, we have our own capital that we'll trade instead, that we'll sort of put into the employ so that we can get all the other things that we need that way. And so when we're thinking like that, then that makes us more peaceful in some ways, because we're not thinking of ourselves as part of a glorious kingdom, sort of subjects of a king, perhaps, who are, we're now going to fight on behalf of the king. We have to do our duty to God and the king. That's gone away. It's more about like, what can I get for myself? Right? It's a bit selfish, and a little bit less glory, right, and honor and that sort of thing. And capitalism does that for Schumpeter. And one of the examples he gives, he says, look, the United States, Schumpeter says, we're going to use that as the example. We're going to show that the United States, it's the least feudal country. It's never really had a feudal system here in the United States. Well, it's at least the least feudal of all the Western countries. And it's the most capitalistic country. And so Schumpeter says, well, look, it's the most capitalistic country, and it has the least imperialistic inclinations, right? And that proves, to some degree, things Schumpeter, right? That capitalism individualizes us and makes us less imperialistic. So it has the least imperialistic inclinations, and as evidence of that, he says, look, we had this war with Mexico in the War of 1846 to 1848, and we beat Mexico. We could have taken the whole country, but we didn't. We only took a small part of it. And that shows, right, that the capitalism, because the United States is the most capitalist country, and because they didn't take the whole of Mexico, so they're not imperialistic, just a little bit. And so we see then that capitalism leads to individualization and less imperialistic drive. Doyle discusses Schumpeter, and he says, look, the problem is there's not a lot of empirical evidence to say that liberal states are pacifistic. If we look at liberal states today, if we look at Britain today, hey, let's look at the United States today. You can't exactly say that the United States, and I did say this, I think, a little bit earlier, but you can't exactly say that the United States is a pacifist country, says Doyle, right? And you look at the Second World War, you look at the First World War, you look at Vietnam, perhaps, you look at Korea. The United States is not shying away from what, obviously more recently, although Doyle couldn't be saying this because he's writing in 1986, but you see there's the first Gulf War, right? There's later on, there's the second Gulf War with the invasion of Iraq. There's Afghanistan. There's before that, there's Grenada. I mean, there's all sorts of situations where the United States has got itself into war. So yeah, sure. Well, and look at what Schumpeter is saying. He's saying, look, we had that war with Mexico, and that shows that we are not imperialistic as we didn't take the whole of Mexico. So it's not that the United States. So Doyle says, look, it's not that the United States is pacifistic. We can't really say that. And he says more generally, like empirically, if you look at the actions of liberal countries, they don't all avoid war. And we sort of picked on the United States because Schumpeter uses them as the example. But I mean, any liberal country we choose, Britain, for example, which would be another one. You see, well, of course, they were both also involved in the First World War and the Second World War. There was a war in Aden. There was the Suez crisis, where they tried to go into a war with Egypt. There was, and then of course the British as well were involved in the same wars more recently with the Americans. The First Gulf War, the second one. Both the Britain and the United States were involved in the Bosnian war or the Kosovo war as well. So liberal states are not pacifistic, says Doyle. The other thing Doyle says is like, look, is it like, are people really, as the economists say they are they really just sort of have self-interested economic motives? So even if capitalism does individualize us, is all we care about sort of enriching ourselves, like making ourselves more comfortable, or is there something in us, in you and me, that does make us want perhaps glory, right? Perhaps glory, perhaps some sort of status. We want to be, maybe we still want to be part of a country that's powerful, right, and that holds sway in the world. Maybe there's some status that comes from that, you know. And so, Doyle asks, right, do people really only care about themselves as economic beings, or do they also have these other desires too, such as political power? And of course, the realists, Morgenthau says, well, that's a psychobiological drive to dominate, and so that would make us warlike, even if we might be individualistic in terms of our economic needs. You know, and then the other thing is, right, is that the Schumpeter, you know, not all states are liberal anyway, not all states are capitalistic. And so, you know, that's, and certainly when Doyle was writing this is, you know, it's towards the end of the Cold War in 1986, but the Soviet Union still exists, right? So there's still, you know, there's still this whole other political theory, there's a whole other completely different basis for formation of society that's going on, right? That might not be capitalistic for a start. And so then that doesn't solve that doesn't completely explain why there might not be any war or as much war, because you have these states that exist that are even not liberal. So that wouldn't necessarily explain it. Here we get to Machiavelli, right? We're talking now about liberal imperialism. And Machiavelli's making in some ways the opposite point, or he's sort of, he's furthering Doyle's point, right? That maybe republics are not pacifistic. When I use the word republic here, of course, republic has to, like liberal state, republic also has a specific meaning. But for the purposes of international politics, when we talk about republics, all we really need to know, and this would be different if you're in my POS 210, because we might go more detailed into what a republic is, but for the purposes of international politics, again, it's just about the fact that that citizens, or that members of the state, normal people, everyday people, have some sort of a say in the governance of the country, right? And it's worth saying this at this point, to sort of compare this to realist theories, especially to neo-realist theories of international politics. You know, somebody like Ken Waltz, he's interested in the systemic level. Once we start to ask about, is this state liberal or not, or is this state a republic? Do the citizens of the state have some input into the foreign policy of this state? Once we start to ask those sorts of questions, we're really down into the unit level. It's a level that Waltz, and I think to some extent Mearsheimer as well, would say, no, don't go there. There's no answers there. Look at the system level. So notice that as well, that as we move into liberalism, we are much more considerate of state level factors, like is this a liberal state? Is this a state where people have control over the government, some input into the government at least? So Machiavelli says, look, republics are actually not pacifistic. They like war, and in fact, a republic is actually the best form for imperial expansion. Remember when Machiavelli's writing, it's sort of the beginning of the Renaissance in Europe, in Italy in particular, and Italy at that time, and you know, to some extent Germany as well, what becomes Germany later on. It's much smaller states, right, sort of city states. And it's sort of handy, right, having these sort of small city states in Italy, sort of isolated perhaps in some way from the rest of Europe by the sea and by the mountains. And then also you have all these different forms of government in each of these different small city states. And that's the context in which Machiavelli is writing, that's the political context. And so he's looking at the different city states, and he's saying the best ones, the ones that expand the most easily, the ones that grow, they're the republics. And in fact, if you have a republic, expansion is the best way to survive. Like so republics are expansive. They facilitate expansion and they necessitate expansion. And I think we'll talk more about that on the next slide. But if I turn over the slide and it's not, I'll continue to explain. Okay, it is that. One reason is that free citizens make the best soldiers. If you're asking, this is the second point here, but if you're asking people to fight for the public glory and the common good, if you're asking them to do that, the thing with a republic is that when you ask citizens in a republic to do that, there's some connection between the citizens and the thing that you're asking them to fight for. This public good, that's their good. It's not the king's good, right? Or it's not an oligarchy at the top that own everything and you have to fight so that they can keep hold of what they've got. In a republic, says Machiavelli, the things that everybody's got, like not just the rulers or the elite have, everybody has it. And so, I don't know, imagine, one of the things you're defending, I'm thinking of Florence, right? I'm thinking of the Medicis, right? And they're building this Duomo, right? This cathedral there in Florence. And, they're putting the effort into building it, and they're all working together. And, the city owns it. And you say, well, who's the city? And the city's the people, right? They have this sort of a council, right, of families that live there. And that's theirs, they own it. So it's one thing to defend a church that you've built and you sort of own, that's yours, that you feel connected to. And another thing to be asked to defend, the king's palace or something, or the castle, right, where the king lives and all of his entourage, right? That's a different prospect now. And so what Machiavelli is saying is like, your citizens might fight harder if they own the thing that they're trying to defend, if they have some ownership with it. They belong to the citizens. The other thing is that in a system, in a city where you do have the sort of right to own things, and that you own them freely from arbitrary seizure. The thing is then is that one, people become prosperous. When they become prosperous, they multiply. They have more children, and also there's more things to own, right? Economies expand, and so you've got all these sort of fairly wealthy people who have something to lose, and the king or the chief magistrate or whoever is in the city is not just taking everything off. Right? They can own that, and that's perhaps in Machiavelli's day, right? That's still relatively rare, right? That's not everywhere isn't like that. There isn't every city where you can own something that the duke or king or somebody or prince can just take it off you whenever he wants. If you have some sort of rights, those are rights that that you might fight for. But there's two things. The one is that you might fight for the things that are yours more readily than you might fight for the thing that's the king's. But the second one is that you also, when you can own property, you can become more prosperous. You're going to have more children, bigger families, and everybody's going to become more prosperous. The economy is going to grow. And that growth itself is what Machiavelli is going to tell us is going to lead to expansion. So let's say this is happening. Let's say it's expanding. Let's say we're having this family, and we have a bigger family and a larger, and our sons, and probably sons at that time, right? But let's say our children, they're growing up, and they're having families too. And at some point, right, as we expand, at some point, the place where we're living, the land that's available to us to own, it becomes not enough. And so now I have to choose between, let's say, my sons or between my children. Well, these guys are going to inherit. You folks, I'm sorry, there's just not enough land for you all to live on. And so, you're not going to inherit, and you're going to have to go and work for a living, and who knows what you're going to do. Labor, probably hard labor. Machiavelli himself actually ended up doing manual labor, and he would go and do that in the morning, and then he'd come back and he would change and put his fancy clothes back on, and he would read like diplomatic dispatches and sort of. Anyway, so you get into that situation, and so that's what necessitates expansion. Because if you get too many of those people who don't own anything, who are owning less and less, and maybe not enough to live, to support themselves with, The thing is, if you get a lot of those people in society, things get dicey, right? Because they don't have a stake in society anymore, and they're sort of disgruntled, and then they start to threaten the stability of the city, and perhaps overthrow the government and redistribute the land and that sort of thing. So that's a danger for a republic. It's a danger because of its own success. Right? Its own success causes this danger. Its own expansion, its own increase in wealth causes this problem. Right? So for Machiavelli, that's one of the causes why we have to expand now. So it's not just that we're better fighters or that we're more committed to the fight. It's that actually now it causes the necessity of a greater expansion. The other thing is that just people generally are lovers of glory, right? And that agrees with Morgenthau. That agrees with Morgenthau. People are lovers of glory, and they seek to rule. And at some point, if you're expanding, it gets to be a point where there's nothing for you to rule over anymore, and so there's not enough people, or there's not enough maybe land, there's not enough capital, there's not enough wealth for you to rule over, and so now you've got to start to look abroad beyond the borders of your city-state and increase the size of it. And so for these reasons, Machiavelli thinks that republics, again, city-states where the people have some real say over what happens in the city-state, real part of the government and real ownership, rights of ownership, they expand. One, because they have to expand so that people can keep ruling over more and more and more things. Partly because it makes better soldiers, people are more willing to fight and die for things that's going to benefit them. The same is, so you can kind of see, if you compare this with Schumpeter, who was writing much later, of course, Schumpeter, but you can start to sort of see a bit like sort of a liberal theme, sort of based on economics in some ways, and you can see that Schumpeter thinks that capitalism makes you more pacifistic. Doyle sort of asks the question, well, does it really? And then he shows us Machiavelli, where Machiavelli is saying, actually, the more wealthy you get, the more that's at stake, the more you're willing to fight, the better a soldier you are, and also the bigger the necessity there is to expand, which means that perhaps liberal democracies actually might be more expansive, might be more warlike rather than less warlike. And so Doyle comes and says, well, what's happening here, right? We have these two options. We have liberal pacifism and liberal imperialism. We have these two things, and which is one true and one not true? Or did it used to be, right, that we had liberal imperialism back in the day? Because of course we certainly did have the French Empire, right? We had the British Empire. We had like Manifest Destiny here in the United States, where the United States, a capitalist liberal country, expanded over a full continent, right? And so did we used to have liberal imperialism, and now we've gone pacifistic, right? We've got liberal pacifism, or are there some liberal states that are pacifist and some that are imperialist? And obviously you can have a combination of that, where some states remain pacifist and some change from imperialism to pacifism, and some, perhaps some can go the other way. But this is what Doyle's asking in his piece. And then finally, Doyle talks about Kant, liberal internationalism. So Kant predicts this. He says, look, what's going to happen is that, it won't be that perhaps every country in the world, well, Kant's writing this thing called Perpetual Peace, and I think it's 1775 that he publishes it. Don't be cross with me if I'm a few years out either way, but I think it's about 1775. And what he's doing is writing this sort of prescription of peace. Like, how do we get peace? And one of the things he says is, okay, all countries should have a republican constitution, by which he means only means by that the people, the ordinary people, should have some sort of a say, some sort of input into government, for the same sorts of reasons maybe that Schumpeter was talking about, right? Again, later on. And what he says like those states that do become republican, what will happen is they'll form a confederation, or they should, he says, form a confederation, and they won't fight each other. And, but they might fight against authoritarian states. And I think Doyle says this. He says, look, US, Britain, France, and Italy, as they become more democratic, they put their differences aside to fight against authoritarian states. Maybe in recent history, maybe we could see that, right? Britain and the United States, they used to have conflicts, right? Because there was the Revolutionary War. What's the next one? The War of 1812. There was some rivalry, right, and some conflict between the United States and Britain, and you don't see that as much now. In fact, you see, it's very surprising now when you see one make a move that the other is not backing up, that they're sort of in lockstep now. In France even, right? I mean, France still, back in the 50s, right, they had the de Gaulle, they had their withdrew from NATO and that sort of thing, and they wanted to go their own way. But even the French now, right, you'd be fairly surprised, I think, to see the French, they sort of hang back and didn't go into the Gulf War, perhaps. But, they're generally supportive of the United States and Britain. In Italy too, and of course, Britain and France fought for centuries, being next to each other there in Europe. And France and Italy, of course, fought. So, yes, Germany, we could have put in here too. As these countries become more democratic, they put their differences aside. We might not expect these days, you and I would probably not expect a war between France and Germany, but there used to be wars between France and Germany, right? There was a lot of wars between France and Germany, but now we would be very surprised. We'd almost wouldn't think that could happen. Same with, let's say, Britain and the United States. There were certainly wars in the past, but you would find it hard to imagine a case where that would happen today. And so now we have this sort of pacification within liberal societies. And that's so that's not to say that the United States isn't going to go to war with Iraq, right? They did. It's not to say that they're not going to go to war in Vietnam, because they did. But what we're saying is that the liberal states won't go to war with each other. We'll talk much more about that in a different lecture. Doyle sort of comes to this sort of conclusion, right, that some wars are fought by liberal states against authoritarian ones where necessary, like when they're necessary to defensive wars. Think of, if you go back and sort of look at the political debates about whether the United States and whether Britain, for that matter, should go into Iraq. You'll see that there was a big debate, and in Britain in particular, there was very large protests against the war. Right, so even in situations where war seems, certainly winnable, but not. That's not really what I want to say. When war seems, in some ways, perhaps justified, at least to a great extent, it's still very hard to convince everybody that war is justified, right? So that's again the argument that states are liberal states are somewhat less eager to go to war, less likely, and less, there's less will to fight. But Doyle admits, look, liberal states do invade weak non-liberal states, acting as the aggressor. So you'll be hard pushed to find a war between two liberal states on opposite sides, but there probably wouldn't be that hard pressed to find cases where liberal states have invaded and are being the aggressor against non-liberal states that are maybe sometimes slightly weak. All right, more about Kant now. He says, look, perpetual peace. I think I started with perpetual peace. I forgot about this slide, but let's go into a bit more detail since the slide invites us to. Kant, he writes this thing called Perpetual Peace. I think it's 1775, like I said before. And he says, look, and this first point, it's important about human nature for liberals. Sometimes people say, and you can see why they would say it, but they say, oh, liberals think that, in international relations, liberals think that humans they have a more optimistic idea about human nature, right? And so then sometimes as students, we might think, oh, well, if I think humans are bad and sort of ambitious and warlike, then I'm a realist. And if I'm sort of have this very sort of positive outlook that, well, people can be nice to each other, people are naturally kind, and people can get along, then I should be a liberal. And that's a very oversimplification of the two theories. Kant, who is certainly sort of provides a basis for liberalism in international relations today, says, look, people don't have to be angels. We don't need moral angels. We just need devils who can learn. And so Kant's not because a realist, if Kant was like, no, people are good, a realist can just say, no, people are bad, right? And then, then you're stuck. But liberals usually want to engage with the realists and say, no, look, people might be bad, they might be devils, but they can learn and they can change their behavior based on new information. Whereas realists think that actually people behave the same now as they did like 400 years ago or 1,000 years ago. Liberals think that, people might have inclinations that are quite brutal, but they can be educated away from that. They can learn. Anyway. Then we've got this one. Asocial sociability leads to cooperation and conflict. Unnecessary resources leads towards republican government. Aha. Yeah, this is what Kant's saying, that look, the thing is, we do have these competitive instincts and we do want to get one over on our neighbors. Maybe we want the things that our neighbors have, and maybe we're prepared to steal them, take them from them by force. But he says, the thing is, what we realize is that we actually can't provide all of our needs individually. And so we have to work together. And so we look at the other people and we say, yeah, I really want their things. And like, yeah, they have some of the things I need, and I want them, I need them. But it's hard to live alone. And I can't on my own provide everything that I need. And so I'm going to live with these people because I have to for my own benefit. But because I realize that I am maybe not pleasantly disposed towards them, I just want to take their things and, not leave them with nothing. They probably feel the same way about me. And so we need each other. And so we have to live together. And so we have to have some sort of rules. And so what we'll do then is that we will create these sort of republican form of government where, we have to give a little bit and take a little bit, right? I'm going to get my needs met. He's going to get his needs met. I'm going to have rules for when that happens and how that happens and how we decide, who gets what when. And he and I should have equal input, because of course I'd like to have all the input and just make him my slave, but he's not going to go for that. He's going to want to do the same to me. And so rather than have that, let's cooperate in some sort of democratic way. Republican government does away with war because the ownership of the state by a monarch. I just read that point out and I don't understand what I was saying there. Let me read it again. Yeah, I think this is the point that we've already mentioned, although it's not very well written. I should change it. But it's the point that we've already talked about, that if you have a republican government which arises in the way that we just mentioned for Kant, then the people own the state, right, themselves, not a monarch, right? If the monarch owns the state, right, and owns all the people in it, then war is more likely. But if we all own it, then it's less likely. But there's still times, and this is the next one, there's still times when war happens. It's not that they're completely pacifistic, but popular war still remains. If you and me, we've come to this agreement that we're going to live together and we're going to govern ourselves in a way where you sometimes get what you want and I sometimes get what I want. If we're going to do that, then there might be some times where you and I both think that it's the right thing to do to go to war with our neighbor, and that might be rare, because we might want to be, because war is expensive. Because instead of now building an extra wing on my house, I've got to go and build some sort of a sword and a shield and go out there and have a fight in the cold and maybe get my arm chopped off or something like that, and that's going to be quite devastating for me. So I'd rather not do that, but there might be occasions where you and I agree that that's like the only thing we can do if we want to survive, and so then that still exists. It's just that we're very reluctant to do it. And then internal arrangements fuel external relations. Aha, this is a good piece, and we're gonna cover this in another lecture as well. But it goes like this. It's that because you and I have formed this republic, right, and a few other people as well, and we're all in this republic together, and we understand the reasoning behind it, right? Because of the things that I've talked about before, right? We went our own way, but I don't want to be a slave, and you don't want to be a slave, and so we both get that, and so we figure out a way where we can share the government, share the power, and that sort of thing. And we go, yeah. And so then when we look at other states around us, right, our neighbors, and we say, well, these guys over there, they're a republic like us. And so they've come to the same sorts of arrangement that you and I have come to, right? So they understand the whole problem, right, of not what, they don't want to be slaves, and then because they don't want to be slaves, and now they've agreed to govern each other, right, in certain respects and with certain proper procedures, and that, and they've done the same as we've done, right? And so they understand that, and so we look at them and we see that, okay, well, they respect one another's rights like we're respecting each other, and they come to the same sorts of arrangements that we've come to. And so we might be more pleasantly disposed because we'll assume that they'll treat us the way that they're treating each other, and they'll assume that we'll treat them the same way that we treat each other, right? As people who, yeah, like, again, we have to be careful of, and so, but we have to respect their rights because then they'll respect our rights, and we'll do the same as a state, and they'll do the same as a state. So we'll get along together with other republics. But when we see an authoritarian government, we'll look at them and we'll say, look at those guys are slaves, and the slaves of this king, and that king's going to want to make us slaves too. And that's the thing that we wanted to avoid by forming our republic. And so those guys we're going to be suspicious of, and they're going to be our enemy, right? So you can see that that's what it means, that the internal arrangements, they fuel the external relations. Right? Our arrangement inside of our state, that solidifies the way we see those other states and the relationship we have with those other states. We want to protect ourselves from that enslaving monarch over there, while at the same time we want to live alongside and respect and be respected, right, by these other republics. And similarly, like if actually what's happened is you've enslaved me and everybody else around you, and you're actually the king, right? You might be, because of the arrangement inside of this monarchy that we live in, and that we're all following you, and you get whatever you want, and we have to do what you tell us, or you just cut our heads off or something. Well, then when we look outside to other states, we might look at the other monarchs and see, okay, well, they want to enslave everyone like I've enslaved, and they better not enslave my people, because I need my people. And you might look at the republic and say, look at them, they're very different from us, right? I don't know, you might not see them as a threat, maybe. You might expect them to respect you. I don't know. I've never done it from that side before, from the side of the autocrat, because that's not really a liberal thing to do. So when we talk about liberalism, it's sort of the counter example, but there you go. We're at the end now, the end of that lecture. Hopefully it gives you a good solid basis on the origins of liberalism. When I say origins of liberalism, it's like, where do the basic ideas of liberalism in international relations, where do they come from? Right? And so Schumpeter, Machiavelli, and Kant, those three, and these are the things that they say. Doyle, it's a good piece. It critiques what these early people are saying, and it builds a sort of modern liberalism, which we will build as we carry on through these lectures in this section.